Hello Lanas, you're watching video on Hermione's Squad, a group of literary students initiative. If you are new to this channel, please do like, share and subscribe. Today we will deal with Augustan Age. Since this age is too long, we will do it in two parts. Today, let's deal with part 1. Augustan Age. The term Augustan applies loosely to the literature and art of the early 18th century up to the time of Jonathan Swift, with its beginning in the end of Restoration period. The original Augustan Age was the brilliant literary period of Virgil, Horace and Ovid under the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar, who came to power after the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC and is regarded as the first Roman emperor. In the 18th century and later, however, the term was frequently applied also to the literary period in England from approximately 1700 to 1745. It was poet Oliver Goldsmith who first designated the early 18th century as the Augustan Age. 18th century in England was an age equal to the age of Augustus Caesar, when the Roman society had reached the peak of its glory. And the term Augustan was applied as a term of high praise because the age of Augustus was the golden age of Latin literature, so the early 18th century in England was the golden age of English literature. This epithet serves to bring out the analogy between the first half of the 18th century and the Latin literature of the days of Virgil and Horace. The leading writers of the time themselves drew parallel to the Roman Augustans and deliberately imitated their literary forms and subjects, their style and elegance, and their ideals of moderation, decorum, and urbanity. It is also known as the Classic Age. First, that the poets and critics of this age believed that the writers of classical antiquity presented the best models and ultimate standards of literary taste. And secondly, in a more general way, that like these Latin writers, they had little faith in the promptings and guidance of individual genius and much in laws and rules imposed by the authority of the past. However, classical works are not just emulated but also parodied during the Augustan period. This span of time is also called the Age of Pope because Alexander Pope was the best known poet of the time. During these years, England was ruled by Queen Anne, King George I and King George II. Queen Anne. Anne was Queen of England, Scotland and Ireland between 1702 and 1707. From 1707, she continued to reign as Queen of Great Britain and Ireland until her death in 1714. Queen Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs in England, remembered for achieving the union of England and Scotland in 1707, thus the first sovereign of Great Britain. And also, she was the first married queen to rule England. Annie was born into the heart of royal and political life in 1665 during the reign of Charles II to his younger brother and heir presumptive James, whose suspected Roman Catholicism was unpopular in England. Annie was the second daughter of James II, the Duke of New York, and his first wife, Annie Hyde. On Charles' instructions, Annie and her elder sister Mary were raised as Anglicans. The Duke and Duchess of York had 8 children, but Annie and Mary were the only ones to survive into adulthood. As Annie grew older, she had been plagued by numerous health problems, and her delicate health necessitated sending her to France, where she spent a part of her childhood with her grandmother and her sister Mary, so that her French was excellent, which came to be useful when dealing with foreign ambassador, later as a queen. When she was born, it was not anticipated that Annie would become a queen. So, her education was primarily in languages and music, which was best suited for a young aristocratic lady, but not so for an heir or heiress to the throne. And her knowledge of history was limited, and she received no instruction in civil law or military matters that most monarchs were expected to have. At the age of 15, her sister Mary became the wife of William of Orange, a staunch Protestant and an avowed enemy of the King of France. Annie's marriage was discussed to a great extent. Her personal feelings were set aside, and at the age of 18, in 1683, Annie married Prince George of Denmark. This was an arrangement Annie's father negotiated in secret with sponsorship by King Louis XIV of France, who hoped for an Anglo-Danish alliance against William of Orange and the Dutch. No such alliance would ever materialize. But by all accounts, her husband, Prince George of Denmark, was a drunk and a crashing bore. And also, he did not affect Annie's position, as he remained politically weak and inactive. But Annie had a tender devotion towards her husband, in spite of all his dull understandings and coarse habits. However, their marriage was saddened by Annie's frequent miscarriages, stillbirths, and the death of children in infancy. The one and only Annie's children survived beyond infancy is William, who became the Duke of Gloucester. Unfortunately, he also died at the age of 12. His death in 1700 ended Annie's hopes of providing herself and the 3 kingdoms with a successor. The Baron Queen, as she came to be known, was unable to produce a living heir even after 17 pregnancies. As was true of many monarchs in history, Queen Anne's path to throne was set by multiple power changes. Power of the throne changed hands based on heredity, and particularly in the time of Queen Anne, the country's largest struggle for its religious identity. When King Charles II died in 1686, Anne's father, James II, became King James II. His Roman Catholicism and his desire to rule without Parliament's input caused Parliament to call on William of Orange and Mary to take the throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Anne supported the revolution and opposed her father. Mary allowed her husband to rule, and neither got along with Anne during their reign. But since they never had children, after Mary died, followed by William in 1702, the throne then passed to Anne. The Settlement Act of 1701 paved the way for Anne's reign. Thus, Anne ascended as the first married queen to rule England. Reign of Queen Anne. Anne Stuart was an unlikely person to become Queen of England. She was shy, stout, gouty, short-sighted, and very small. Although born into reality, her education was similar to that of other aristocratic girls. And also, she was described as homely, and even on her coronation, a lavish and luxurious affair, the 37-year-old queen had to be carried in the ceremony due to an especially debilitating case of gout. Even in her own lifetime, Anne was believed to be too weak to be an effective queen. But this is wrong. Anne proved to be a hard-working, resolute, and popular monarch. Anne's accession to the throne was quiet and uneventful, and is of interest because of its narrow escape of bloodshed and contest. The statesmen then living remembered Charles I, the Protectorate, the Restoration, and the Revolution, and were aware of the possibility of civil war upon the disturbance of certain conditions. Anne's first speech in council was a potent factor in averting any threatening catastrophe. Her first speech to Parliament set the direction of her reign, including her commitment to a Protestant succession. She emphasized her own Englishness in a critique of her Dutch predecessor, William III. Anne was a surprisingly good public speaker, an impressive achievement for somebody normally very shy. The reign of Queen Anne was a brilliant one. Anne was not a brilliant woman like her mother, Anne Hyde, but she inherited good common sense from her mother. It was Anne's policy to take a middle course in the extremes of every kind, a quality much needed in a country that had suffered from Stuart's misrule. She had none of the weaknesses of the Stuarts, but inherited her characteristically English virtues from her Hyde ancestors, who were country gentlemen and great lawyers. She would have made an excellent and a happy wife for a country squire, by devoting her time to good works in church and country pursuits. The welfare of the people was the principal motive of her reign, and her subjects loved her, for they know her to be truly English, as no other stewards had ever been. She liked the things that they liked, and lived like them as nearly as her rank would allow. They sympathized with her childlessness and condoned her little weaknesses. Annie desired to be queen of all her people, and her reiterated avowal that her heart was entirely English raised a hum of approval. The Dutch element in England under William III had long been unpopular, and now there was a queen English by birth and at heart. And Queen Anne was a very hard-working and a dedicated monarch. She took a lively interest in the affairs of state. She attended the House of Lords regularly, met daily with her ministers, and successfully navigated rival political views to dominate politics as a parliamentary monarch. Queen Anne was a patron of theatre, poetry, and music, and some critics prefer to limit the English Augustan Age to a period covered by the reign of Queen Anne, when writers such as Alexander Pope, Joseph Addison, John Gay, and Matthew Prior flourished. Politically, Anne's reign was marked by the development of the two-party system, with Whigs and Tories competing for power. The bitter rivalries between Whigs and Tories that categorized her reign was intensified by uncertainty over the succession to her throne. During her reign, Anne favored moderate Tory politicians who were more likely to share her Anglican religious views than their opponents, the Whigs. The Whigs were aligned with commercial interests and Protestant dissenters, and Whigs grew more powerful during the course of the War of the Spanish Succession until 1710, when Anne dismissed many of them from office. Queen Anne was best remembered for bringing the War of the Spanish Succession to a conclusion. Within months after the accession of Queen Anne, the War of the Spanish Succession began. On 1702, Queen Anne appointed John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, as her Captain General, perhaps in part because he was a great soldier and the husband of her beloved confidant, Sarah Churchill. Under the direction of the Duke of Marlborough, the British Royal Army saw victories in the War of Spanish Succession. The war, which was but a complicated series of alliances and changes in succession among the royal families of Spain, France, and Austria, had kicked off in 1701 and quickly spread to involve all of Europe and even the colonies of North America. At first, Queen Anne continued this war aggressively, but after a series of victories under Marlborough, switched to a more diplomatic approach. The war eventually concluded with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which was in large part possible because of the queen's decision to negotiate instead of fight. Queen Anne was also the first to rule a united Great Britain. It was during her reign that the 1707 Act of Union brought England and Scotland together under a single crown. The last years of the 17th century had seen differing policies pursued by parliaments in England and Scotland, which included disagreements over the succession. To head off a revolt and unite support for the crown, Anne pushed for the Act of Union, which would unite England and Scotland. Actually, the union had been an ongoing discussion for decades, but had stalled several times for various reasons. But Queen Anne's government was able to restart those negotiations in 1706 and finally succeeded in forming a union that could be approved by both the English and Scottish parliaments. Both agreements, the Act of Union and the Treaty of Utrecht, did much to cement Britain's economic strength over France. Anne's reign would be categorized by the attempts of others to manipulate her. She wished to rule independently, but her intellectual limitations and chronic ill health caused her to rely heavily on her ministers. And also, she allowed herself to be heavily influenced by her ministers and her favorites. Among these, of greater political consequence was Anne's intimate relationship with her childhood friend Sarah Churchill, wife of John Churchill. Anne leaned heavily on her for companionship. The reign of Queen Anne is often discussed for her complicated and scandalized relationship with Sarah Churchill. The pair was so close that some suspected that they may have been lovers even before Anne became the queen. After Anne's marriage, she named Sarah to the prestigious position of Lady of Bedchamber. Their relationship could eventually deteriorate due to Sarah's nagging and their many petty arguments. The end of their friendship signaled a change in political influences as well. Some historians believe Anne manipulated her ministers to enact the policies she wanted, while others see her as a monarch manipulated by her ministers. Whatever the case, during her reign, Britain became a major military power on land. Anne's reign was a prosperous time for Britain, a period of significant progress for the country. Anne's reign created modern Britain, and the foundations were laid for the 18th century's golden age. Queen Anne left no clear will. Perhaps her fear of death meant she would not bring herself to sign one, yet she left her country changed forever. Anne walked with a new kind of monarchy that we recognize today. No longer would monarchs rule by the divine right of kings, a belief that led her grandfather Charles I to the scaffold. Instead, monarchs ruled in conjunction with Parliament. However, the Queen herself has received little credit for these achievements and has long been depicted as a weak and ineffectual monarch dominated by her advisors. Queen Anne finally died in 1714 after suffering a series of strokes. George I, her second cousin, succeeded her on Britain's throne. Though her unfortunate happenings in her private life have come to define her reign, it is important to remember her time on the throne was also marked by many progressions for the British Empire. Her death in 1714 marked the end of the Stuart dynasty and paved the way for the Hanoverians, the dynasty of the Georgians who ruled Britain until Queen Victoria. The Hanoverian succession. As Anne, like her sister Mary I, had no heirs, the succession was settled upon the royal house of Hanover. A long line of King Georges, the first, the second, the third, and the fourth ensued, which is why the 18th century is also known as the Georgian period. Queen Anne was succeeded by George I of the House of Hanover, the first Hanoverian king of Great Britain, who was a descendant of the Stuarts through his maternal grandmother, Elizabeth, daughter of James I. Although over 50 Roman Catholics bore closer blood relationships to Anne, the Act of Settlement of 1701 prohibited Catholics from inheriting the British throne. George, however, was Anne's closest living Protestant relative, who was a German. Succession of George I was supported by the Whigs and resisted by the Tories. The following year, George was faced with a rebellion by the Jacobites, supporters of the Catholic James Stuart, who had a strong claim to the throne. This was concentrated mainly in Scotland and was suppressed by the end of the year. Another small rebellion in 1719 was not a serious threat. With some Tories sympathetic to the Jacobites, George turned to the Whigs to form a government, and they were to dominate politics for the next generation. Opposition to the king gathered around George's only son, the Prince of Wales, making their already poor relationship even worse. George was active in British foreign policy in the early years of his reign. His shrewd diplomatic judgment enabled him to help forge an anti-Spanish alliance with France in 1717 and 1718. In 1720, the South Sea Company, with heavy government, royal and aristocratic investment, collapsed. The resulting economic crisis made the king and his ministers extremely unpopular. During George's reign, the powers of the monarchy diminished, and Britain began a transition to the modern system of cabinet government led by a prime minister. This laid the foundations for that form of parliamentary monarchy which has been in existence in England ever since. Towards the end of his reign, actual power was held by the Whigs leader, Sir Robert Walpole, Britain's first Prime Minister, who was left as the most important figure in the administration. His ascendancy coincided with the decline of the political power of the monarchy, and King George became less and less involved in government. King George I remained unpopular in England throughout his life, partly because of his attachment to Germany. He didn't speak English and had no knowledge of British customs, but also because of the perceived greed of his mistresses and rumors concerning his treatment of his wife. His isolation from the English people was instrumental in keeping his power irrelevant. He is perhaps best remembered for his patronage not in art but in music. George I died of a stroke in 1727 on a trip to his native Hanover, where he was buried. He is the most recent British monarch to be buried outside the United Kingdom, and he was succeeded by his son George II. Reign of George II. George II, in full, George Augustus, also called Marcus and Duke of Cambridge, was the only son of George Louis, the King George I of Great Britain. George II is the most recent British monarch born outside Great Britain. He was born and brought up in northern Germany. Upon the accession of his father to the English throne, he was designated Prince of Wales. In 1705, he married Princess Caroline of Brandenburg-Ansbach, an attractive and intelligent woman, and they had 9 children. His father's treatment of his mother, whom he had imprisoned, left son George with a hatred of his father, and they regularly quarreled. He was even put under arrest by his father and was excluded from public ceremonies. The prince's London residence became a rival court and focus for a dissident Whig group headed by Robert Walpole. He encouraged a reconciliation between father and son. This led to Walpole's inclusion in George I's administration, whereupon he lost the prince's favor. When his father died in 1727, he became King George II and set about changing his father's policies. Walpole was expected to be dismissed but survived on the intervention of Queen Caroline. During the first 2 decades of his reign, George II followed foreign and domestic developments closely. He supported Walpole's policy of peace and retrenchment and allowed the ministers to use crown patronage to build up his majority in Parliament. Although he possessed sound political judgment, his lack of confidence caused him to rely heavily on his ministers, most notable of whom was Walpole. Walpole won acknowledgement of George's legitimacy from many influential Tories who has been Jacobite supporters of the exiled Stuart pretender to the English throne. Hence, no politician of prominence deserted George's cause during the abortive Jacobite rebellion of 1745. Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, landed in Scotland, but after some initial success was defeated at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Nevertheless, opposition to George and Walpole grew as the pattern of George I's reign repeated itself. George II and his son Frederick Louis, Prince of Wales, quarrelled, and the prince became a leader of an anti-administration faction. By 1742, these dissidents were strong enough to force Walpole to resign. George II quickly found another mentor in John Carteret, whose haughty ways proved unpopular in political circles. The two men brought England into the War of the Austrian Succession, and in doing so, they gave their opponents an opportunity to charge them with subordinating the interest of England to the needs of George's German possessions. In 1744, George bowed to parliamentary pressure and accepted Carteret's resignation. 15 months later, the king's ministers, by temporarily resigning, forced George to accept into office Carteret's chief opponent, William Pitt, who was later appointed as the Prime Minister. In 1743, George led his troops into battle against the French, the last British king to fight in battle. George II exercised little control over British domestic policy, which was largely controlled by the Great Britain's Parliament. And he spoke some English and some more French, unlike his brother, and his rule was the first full Hanoverian rule in England. By then, the powers of Parliament had silently expanded, and his power was perhaps only equal to that of Parliament. During the last decade of his life, George took little interest in politics, and after his death in 1760, he was succeeded by his grandson, also called George. After the Hanoverian succession, there was a period of stabilization, tolerance, and moderation. Augustan Age Part 1 ends here. We will be back with Part 2 soon. So, thank you all and stay tuned.